So toward the end, when I started gaining more clarity, because if you watch the interview that R.L. Solberg does with me on his channel, Defending the Biblical Roots of Christianity, and some of my other videos, I talk about toward the end, some things happened to affect my conscience and to pull my heart back, that some of these fruits and things and teachings, just there was something not right about them. And about that time and that clarity, I was able to come back to my senses a bit, that I need to be sharing these things with my husband. Some of the things talked about in the women's group, not personal life details. So we were very deep, close friends. We talked about marriage, kids, things that friends talk about. And those things are held in confidence, will always be held in confidence. But as far as belief systems and some of the ideas about scripture and interpretations and other things pertaining to that is what I shared with him. And one of the things I showed you was a Facebook post, actually several Facebook posts that were very pointed. You foolish Galatians, which is a scripture, but pointed at mainstream Christianity, churches around us, people like you and some other of our friends and our family, calling them foolish, talking about lawlessness, the church is lying, things like that. But there was one in particular, I shared with you an idea presented to the women, that since the men were not leading, because I would say our group was led by women the majority of the time, the talking. Would you agree with that?
It really just depends on your definition of leadership, and if you're talking specifically about who took the microphone, I guess you could say, in the majority of meetings that we would have, and what percentage of time who was speaking and how long were they speaking for, then yeah, you could say that the women were leading, if that's your definition.
Okay. And I shared with you that the idea presented was, because the men were not leading, it's time for women to rise up. And this was not just in the context of our group, but in the world of Christianity, that the women needed to take that place because the men were not doing it. That affected you when I shared that with you. It wasn't something that you knew about that was going on. It wasn't, a lot of these things were things you didn't realize the heart of the message, because the heart presented was very different than the heart I began to let you in on. So what was it about that just got your dander up?
I think mostly because of my understanding of leadership and what that statement says based on that understanding of leadership. So I think a lot of people have a misunderstanding of leadership. I see a lot of belief, either expressed in action or expressed in statement, that leadership has something to do with power or control. And that's never been my view. My view on leadership is that leadership is nearly 100% responsibility. And the only reason that power even comes into the equation at all is because if you're ultimately responsible for something and you're not free to make the choices to produce that end result for the responsibility, then you're basically damned if you do and damned if you don't. You don't have the ability to guide it towards the end result that you are then judged for, based on what your responsibility is. And so my entire definition of leadership is all oriented around that responsibility. As I'm a person who has a lot of people that I am responsible for. I have my family, my sons, I have you, I have to try to provide and take care of the family. I also own a company. I have a lot of people that work with me or work for me, and they're depending on me to do my job correctly so that I can continue to pay the bills if they're sending me bills, to pay their salaries if I'm paying their salaries. Their families are dependent on that steady income stream as well. So I take leadership very, very seriously. And if you were to say that I have a fatal flaw in that regard, it's that I take it so seriously that it takes me forever to make a decision. But it's because I view leadership through the lens of basically pure responsibility, that when I see somebody say, that it's their job to now take the responsibility away from the person they believe currently has that responsibility. It is an extreme insult from my perspective, because not only are you critiquing their job in leadership, which is not only fine but normal and good, to saying that they're not just doing a job you disagree with, but they're doing such a poor job that you need to rip them from the place of responsibility that they currently hold and take that responsibility yourself. That is not just an insult in many cases, but I think a rush to judgment from my perspective, because it means that you are so confident and so sure about your perspective on what they should be doing as a leader, that whether you have any background as a leader, whether you have any background in wielding responsibility and being ultimately responsible for what happens to other people or not, you think that your way of doing it is so guaranteed and so right that you're willing to totally remove the person who has been doing it and replace that person with yourself. And so when I see something like that, it immediately reads to me like a rush to judgment, a sense of, as a form of overconfidence, a lack of humility in some cases, and sort of a headstrong rush into ways of doing things that may not have been tested or proven. And I'm not saying, like, this is not a commentary on, women holding positions of leadership at all.
And, and the reason you're saying this is not, anything against women in leadership in particular areas is because you and I both hold to a complementarian view of men and women, where we're equal but not the same. And so there are specific rules, specifically in the church setting, lined up for men and women. And there are certain qualities that men have, and certain qualities that women have, but they're not the same. And things happen when we try to usurp each other and take that place as well.
Right. It's just a basic belief that there are things, some of them are biological, some of them are just differences in skill. There are things that you can do that I can't do. Biologically, I can't take the responsibility of having babies. I'm not a seahorse. It's not going to work. If we're going to have a family, you're going to have to do that job. When it comes to skills, we definitely have different sets of skills, but in some cases we have a little bit of an imbalance of skills too, because my skills are all focused in a handful of areas that are very important. But outside of those areas, there's a multitude of other areas that you have skills in that are absolutely vital to the success or failure of our entire family. And so, I definitely look at this as there are different skills and roles that can't, in some cases it's different from one couple to another. In some cases it's just the nature of how things are. And you can't just throw those to the wind and exchange them without the possibility, at least, if not the probability, that something's going to go wrong there.
And what you said to me the other day, and you'll have to correct me if I'm not quoting you correctly, but you had said that it wasn't this issue of, because you have said to me, and I agree with you, that whether a husband has been put in a leadership role by God, so whether or not he's leading actively or passive, he's still leading. And so it's a matter of not just you're not leading. It's like a woman saying, you're not doing this right. Do you remember, how do you put that? You put that so much better the other day.
It's a perspective of looking at that. I think the definition of leadership as responsibility really answers a lot of this, because I think, obviously I can't speak for all men, but I think a predominant belief amongst men, especially those who are family men, is that leadership really is about responsibility, not about power. And so they take a load of responsibility onto their backs and they try to carry it. And when you do that, there's a whole bunch of things that come with it. Certain, in one sense, you have a lot less time than when you're not doing that. In other ways, it requires you to do things that you may not even necessarily want to do. So to give you an example of what I mean by that, sometimes when we're making decisions as a family, I have to make a decision that sometimes the entire family doesn't agree with. And it's because I don't ignore the rest of the family. I ask you if the children need to be involved in whatever it is that we're making a decision on. I make sure that I ask them as well. But if there's something that I know, that I can see from the position I've been put in, that the rest of the family can't see, and I know they can't see that, and I'm responsible for the outcome, and I'm going to be judged by the consequences, and that's going to have significant consequences, then whether I care about what my children have to say or your opinion, whether I absolutely respect it, whether I can see it from your vantage point or not, the reality is that at the end of the day, the consequences are going to come from the decision that's made. And if I know what those consequences are, whether I can see it from your standpoint and agree with you in some level or not, it doesn't matter anymore, because the consequences do matter, because we will live those. And so I have to own that and then make my decision from that. And that's, to your question there, I think really what is the difference there? Like if you have a biblical look at things, or biblical view of things, then the biblical view is that the husband is the spiritual leader of the family, and the spiritual leader role. I'm basically then responsible for the kind of men that my sons become, the direction that our family goes, to make sure that it's in a direction it's positive. It's moving us closer to God. It's moving us closer together as a family, not driving us apart. There's all these different consequences that I'm considering. And so that being my responsibility, to look at that responsibility and say it's being done wrong because it doesn't have the outcome that you want. And not you personally, but like if you're looking at it and saying, well, I don't like the way that's being done, so I think I need to do it instead. Especially if you haven't looked at what those consequences are from all of those different angles. Your best case scenario is that you're rushing to judgment. Your best case scenario. And it's also a very big difference to go from I disagree with this to I'm going to depose you, like from the role that I think you are supposed to be taking us in our family.
Then you're not doing it. I'm going to do it, even though I don't know the weight of responsibility you carry. I can do it better.
Yeah, well, and I mean, at least in our family, I don't know if this is always true with everybody, but there's certain types of scenario that I'm going to be able to handle a lot better. Just because I have a little bit more tolerance to objections. Like there's certain, like it's just like if you have to discipline your kids, you may need to ground them, you may give them some consequence. They're going to object. They're going to object very loudly. And especially when they get older, that can be more difficult to absorb that. And I'm, in our family, I'm the one who's wired to just absorb it. I know that this consequence is going to produce a result that's better for my children. And so if they want to rage against me, that's okay. I can handle that. It doesn't change the fact that I love them. It doesn't change what I need to do. And so that's another part of my responsibility in leadership as well, since I'm the one that has the ability to do that a little better. And you had a lot better way of handling that when they were little, but as they got bigger, it changed.
Yeah. So we're going to switch gears a little bit because there are some things going on in some marriages that is very controlling. And I have had women talk to me about how they're not allowed to do certain things anymore. So if say their husband is in Hebrew roots and they're being very controlling and saying, you're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do that. And then there was a woman on the flip side, who not in Hebrew roots, who actually commented to me, to one of my videos, and said, "Why didn't your husband stop you? I feel sorry for you." What would you say to those, both sides of the coin, which are basically saying controlling, or you should have controlled? What is your view on that, on me going down this path, and how you dealt with me through that process?
So on the first part, when it comes to people that are in situations where one of the spouses is trying to control the other to try to push them towards a Hebrew roots line of thought, there's only so much I can really say on that, because the only way that I experienced that was when you were confronting me about your views about me getting coffee on Saturdays. And for that, I knew what I believed, and I wasn't going to change it just because we had a difference of opinion. So I just held to that. I wasn't fighting with you on purpose. I wasn't arguing with you. I wasn't going out of my way to yell or disagree. I just said, look, we have a difference of opinion on this, and I'm going to do what I believe to be right. And that was it.
You're going to express your freedom because you did not agree that you weren't free to go do this.
Yeah, I mean, as you said earlier, we have a relationship that's based on mutual respect. I was not going to change that just because we had a difference of opinion. It's just like any other difference of opinion. I knew what I believed. I was going to do that. It wasn't something in that case that was having big enough effects that it was taking on a trajectory change for the entire family at the time.
At least not yet.
Not yet, yeah. And so I didn't need to say any more than that. I just continued to do what I thought needed to be done. Mm-hmm. And that included with the way that, when our son would ask for pizza on the weekend, I would decide, okay, well, I don't have a problem getting him a pizza, so I'll get him a pizza. Right. And that was kind of the extent of it. So, when you're in that situation, if you're the one who is on the receiving end, that's about as much as I can say. And that's not even remotely commentary on somebody who's taken it too far. Mm-hmm. Because the other thing is that you weren't taking it so far as to be abusive. I don't know what that's like.
But I was being difficult. Difficult,
sure, but that's no different than any other conversation in marriage. If we have differences of opinion,
it's difficult.
It's difficult. But there's a difference between when it's difficult and when somebody's gone so far as to demand and or be abusive. And I don't know what it is to be on the receiving end of that. Mm-hmm. So I can't really speak to that.
But you did confront me, like we talked about a little bit ago. You did confront me that the judgment toward the end, when I was getting more judgmental and just contempt for basically people who don't follow the law, is you called me out. You said, no, that's not how it's going to be in this house.
I did.
But you didn't say it like that.
No, I didn't say it that way.
But you got the message across.
It was just, I was setting a boundary, as you like to put it. And the other thing too is that, again, the reason that worked out for us is because our entire relationship is built on that mutual respect. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't mean that we don't have times where that mutual respect falls apart, because we do.
Because we're people.
Yes, but that being a foundation makes our relationship something where that worked for us, where
right.
we could have a disagreement like that and it didn't blow up.
What do you think you would have done? So, when I was showing you the Facebook posts and some things that were going on specific to the belief, not personal information, but had I brought that to you sooner, or had you seen a Facebook post of mine that if you had seen, now I had not done this, but if I had posted, you are lawless or things like that, I think you would have handled things very differently. To speak to that woman who's like, why didn't your husband stop you? Well, one, because he's not controlling, he's respectful and loving.
Oh, that's the other side of this.
That's the other side, but how do you think you would have handled that had these things come to light sooner out of me? If you had seen those things coming from me?
That's a good question. I think if you were expressing things that strongly, that conversation about how you were judging the entire family would have happened a lot sooner. Because in my mind, there's no way to really read statements like that and not read them as judgment, and also not just judgment, because that word gets thrown around flippantly these days, but it's a specific type of judgment where the entire basis for the judgment is that there are a set of rules that we're bound to, and we weren't even in agreement on that set of rules. And so, if you had been saying things like that earlier, that would have tipped me off a lot faster to the fact that we were operating out of totally different playbooks. And so we would have had to have that discussion as well. I don't know exactly how it would have played out, but I know it would have come up. And I have to think that if it had gone poorly, it probably still would have been something where I just called out the incompatibilities with the line of thinking, and then the condemnation, I guess you could say, on the family that produced.
Yeah. And I think it's important for people to know that you just didn't know what was going on. It was not presented for a long time till the end when we were talking about things and going, and things were coming to light for you, but it just wasn't presented as anything to a bystander who wasn't in the personal Bible study. It was presented as, we're just seeking truth together. We're just seeking these ideas together, and we have the freedom to do these things within the body. Come to find that wasn't the case.
As I said a little bit earlier, it's a very subtle shift. And when you look at it in retrospect, or when you look at it from a very matter-of-fact perspective, like what I'm doing right now, it sounds like it's this giant chasm, because the net effect is that it is. But in the middle of it, it's actually very subtle, because you could be doing things. In fact, a lot of the time, I think the way that I saw this play out when I look back on it is that most of the people, when they got into this originally, were looking at it from a we're free to do these things perspective. And at some point, it just subtly shifted, because it was this pure-hearted desire to draw closer to God, and the belief that to do that, you had to obey his commands, and then try to find out more about his commands, and then obey them further, and just keep on going down this sort of cycle of obedience to commands to express love, which, if you're reading the Bible, I can totally see how you would get stuck in a spiral like that, because of how much law is in the Old Testament that was written for the Hebrews. And at some point along the way, this shifted from just being about you're free to also do this, to a bit of a game of, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the holiest of them all, and then rule making for others, and judgment, and in some level, kind of an attempt to control others.
So, in a marriage, and I don't, if you're comfortable answering this, just whatever your wisdom is on this, in a scenario where the spouse is trying to control, whether the person is on the Torah side or the non-Torah side, what is your advice to the spouse that is trying to control? Like, you're not allowed to watch this. You're not allowed to go here. You're not allowed to have this person as your friend. What would you say to that? To that person trying to control their spouse in that way? Would you say that's good leadership?
I wouldn't even call that leadership. That's a lot of other leadership training that I've had would probably term that more management. It's more about the power. Basically, there's some basic math on this, and I think this explains a little bit about where was the husband? Where was he during this whole mess? Why wasn't he doing anything? For one, I didn't know about it. Not to the extent that I eventually did. And when I eventually did, we started having some conversations that redirected where things were going. But for 2, if you're looking at this from a perspective of you need to make this other person do something a certain way, you believe you control that person, and you don't. I mean, that's one of the first things that you learn whenever you're being taught by somebody who has a real grip on this. And I've had many mentors that have taught me on this extensively, is that the only person that you have any control over is yourself. You have absolutely no control over anyone else. And it seems like the default understanding that a lot of people have is exactly the opposite of that. They believe they have absolutely no control over themselves, and the only thing they can control is somebody else. Because in practice, that seems to be the way that it comes out in a lot of places. Since I know that I can't control you, I'm not going to try. Because if I try, I will fail, and the question is, how bad are the consequences? It's not a question of whether I'll succeed. The best case scenario, if I try to control you, is that I get some circumstances that I think are better and ultimately build a degree of resentment that separates the relationship. That's not the outcome I'm looking for. And so, I can't control you. I'm not going to try. That doesn't mean I'm not going to confront you. It doesn't mean I'm not going to express where there's a point of difference or disagreement. It doesn't mean that I'm going to appease you.
Which
and just
you
do,
did all those.
You
led well in all those things.
It just means that I don't control you. And so in an area where I don't control you, the only option I have is to trust God. And on some level, to trust you. Because I've known you for a long time. I knew that you were the kind of person who's looking to find the truth. You're the kind of person who's looking to correct yourself when you find you've made a mistake. You have a long history of doing that. And so if I trust God and I know that you're that kind of person, then if given enough time, that will work itself out, because God's not going to bail on you, and you're not likely to suddenly become somebody who doesn't care about those things because you've spent your whole life caring about those things. So in some sense, for me to try to control you would be for me to kind of try to play God, but even he doesn't do that. God is not intervening in every bad situation and then trying to force it into a good situation. I think there's plenty of evidence that makes it clear that that's not how he operates. And so if he doesn't feel that it, as an all-powerful, good being, if he doesn't feel that he should intervene in every wrong situation and try to force it to the right from his perspective, I shouldn't be trying to do something different than he's doing.
So I'm going to bring it back to present day. We are part of an incredible church right now. We have been really blessed with a church body. It's like the things that we lost have been given back to us tenfold. Would you agree with that?
Mm-hmm.
Like, just such a blessing. So stepping back into the larger church body and coming through, leaving the church body and going in a small group, we learned that we made some mistakes together.
Mm-hmm.
What are some things that, if someone is out there and they're thinking, I'm having issues with the church, I'm having issues with the abuse of grace or the cultural things you were talking about, and the focus is not on God and not on our mission. And again, we are not picking on churches. This is something that we're seeing going around in the world. There are lots of different factors, lots of different inputs of this kind of thing. But if a couple now is saying, we're going to step out, we're going to just create a small group and that's it. What is your advice on that now, looking back? What is your perspective on all of that?
I think for most people, I would say definitely don't rush to judgment. We didn't rush to judgment. These are decisions that we made over the course of 6 months to 6 years. They were very slow, and we tried to make sure that we had exhausted what we believed to be other routes to make sure that we weren't rushing to make haphazard decisions. So definitely don't rush to judgment. Consider things as thoroughly as you can, and definitely scrutinize yourself.
Because we spent a long time going to talk to pastors and trying to work out our relationships and differences.
Well, and asking whether I'm the one who's wrong here.
Right.
You know, we weren't rushing to judgment on that either, but we had to ask that question, and we had to let it have enough time to test itself to make sure that we didn't feel that we were wrong there.
Right.
But I think also I would say don't rush to discount what you have. You know, one of the things that I think is very common for, especially if you're in the United States, is we're a very consumer-oriented culture, and consumer-oriented culture is definitely self-focused, and it's prone to critique. And it's also, I think, currently got a little bit of a narcissistic element to it. And it's very easy when you're spending all of your time in that sort of environment to look at things and rush to a conclusion that somebody else is not doing the job, they're not meeting my needs, they're not doing it the right way because I feel off in some way, and kind of judging the entire world through a lens of what you think and what you feel. And even when you're trying to avoid doing that, it's hard to not get hit with that at times. And so I think for me, I saw the things that were wrong, and I don't think I was wrong about what I identified as wrong. But I think that this was a situation where I jumped to a strategy that I wasn't equipped to handle. Like, I was trying to take responsibilities. This is almost me judging myself in the same way that I'm talking about other forms of leadership. I took on responsibilities thinking that I could handle them because I didn't see others handling them to the extent that I thought they should. And then when I found out that, you know what, this is harder than I thought it was, and I'm not equipped to do some of these things, I'd already jumped in and kind of reaped some of the consequences from all of that. So literally, I'm saying don't do what I did, not just from a standpoint of taking that responsibility onto yourself when you're not equipped to handle it, and thinking that you can just depose the other people that are already there. But just don't take for granted a lot of things that are there. Community is important. Structure is important. People that have skills in either leadership or teaching or preaching or I guess a lot of people would call it pastoring, the job of sort of tending to problems that arise in the groups of people. There's all these different roles that come with being in a position of church leadership, being in a church. And it's very easy for us to take those for granted and not, move on and do our own thing. And then you've suddenly lost your community. You've lost your sense of structure. You're suddenly flailing about in the wind. You don't know what you're doing. You feel like you've got responsibilities on you and you don't feel like you're equipped to handle them. And then it turns out you're not. All of that stuff could have been avoided if I had waited a little bit longer and looked for all of those things minus the part that I was right about. With the over focus on cultural issues, if I'd have found something that had all the other things and subtracted that and then did have more of a community orientation, I would have skipped the detour.
Mm-hmm. Right, because we stayed a long time in the larger church body, and churches tried to work it out. And then during that pause of figuring things out, rather than visiting other churches and continuing to make sure we were plugged into a body, we segued into, let's just not be part of that bigger body. Is that
Yeah. I mean, this is kind of a pride comes before the fall thing, I guess you could say. Yeah. It's
a recipe for going wayward, which is what happened to many.
Yeah, I mean, in different ways.
In different ways.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything else that, as far as marriage and relationships and the control and, what would you say to husbands who have a wife who is going through this? Who is like, what are some signs maybe they should look for, or questions they should ask her? How would you have them handle? Or even, Well, just how would you handle that?
I think if, regardless of who the spouse is, I think if somebody is if there's one spouse that's definitely deeper into the Hebrew roots movement and there is another that isn't, I think that the spouse that isn't should probably ask the question of, where are you coming from with this? Are you coming from a framework where we are free to do these things? Or are you coming from a framework where we're not free to not do these things? And in my experience, that question is one that may not get a direct answer. It's something where a lot of times it seems like it becomes immediately uncomfortable for the person who just got asked, and they'll try to, say, well, we have to do these things if we really love God, and we should do them more if we really do them more, but there's grace. And then they can't really delineate how that all glues together. Mm-hmm. If you get an answer like that, the answer may very well mean that they're leaning at least closer to the idea that you're not free to not do them, mm-hmm. if they're not fully on board with that. And you're going to have that discussion a little bit more deeply to make sure that you're both clear on where you each stand. Mm-hmm. And you're going to have to be, for the health of the relationship, okay with the fact that you may find out you disagree with each other. And that's no different than anything else in marriage, but for some reason it really chokes a lot of people up, especially when it comes to religious matters. And so, if you're having a conversation about spiritual issues and you find that you disagree on some things, pick your battles. Not every battle needs to be fought, not every battle needs to be won. There are certain battles that are really more battles for who's got control and whether you're going to control the other person. If you're having one of those battles, it doesn't matter who you're fighting against, or who wins in a sense, because you both lose.
And you may not want to answer this either. I'm going to leave this up to your wisdom, because this isn't something that we talked about before we sat down here. But there are wives who have husbands who are in Hebrew roots or Torah observance. There are different names, different levels, and their husbands are being abusive, either verbally or controlling their activities, telling the wife she can't teach her children the freedom in Christ because he's teaching them these laws. That's a difficult position. Do you have any, and we are not marriage counselors, and we don't want to step on someone's toes. We're certainly a husband's toes. Do you have any advice for her, or words of encouragement to those women who are going through that, and they love their husbands and they want to respect their husbands, and they don't want to fight and they don't want to argue, but they're being controlled? Or is this an area maybe we shouldn't touch? What do you think?
I'm not sure that I'm qualified to answer that. I know, within yourself, you shouldn't change what you believe just because somebody else is forcing you or tempting to force you or pushing you to change your belief. Know what you believe and stick with that belief. In terms of how you express that in a relationship where somebody's trying to control you, I think that really, really depends on that relationship, because there's several gradations of somebody trying to control. There's gradations like what we have, where you were just strongly voicing your displeasure and your opposition. And then there's like, I'm afraid of this person if I disagree with them. Yeah. There are very big differences between those, and what you should do in that situation is so based on what that situation is, mm-hmm. that all I can really speak to is what you can do within yourself. Obviously pray. Mm-hmm. And don't yield your beliefs just because somebody else disagrees with you. But, outside of that, what do you do externally? There's so much context that varies from one relationship to the next that it wouldn't be wise for me to try to advise on that.
Yeah, I agree, until we know their circumstance and know someone very, very well, where we've done life with them.
I mean, and even to some degree, I mean, the only idea that I can say is that if you're in a situation that you don't know how to handle, seek wise counsel. Mm-hmm. That is something I can say, because that's always true. I've had mentors that knew more than I have for my entire life. It's changed the entire trajectory of my life, and I've hit them with all sorts of complicated scenarios.
Like maybe she talked to her dad or a pastor or something. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, dad, pastor, trusted wise counselor. seeking wise counsel, I can say, but obviously you're looking to avoid two things. One is somebody who's just going to agree with whatever you say, and the other is somebody who is, whether they're going to disagree with you or not showing that they have the results that you're after. If they don't have evidence that suggests that they're going to produce the results that you're after from direct experience producing those results, and evidence that they did produce those results, maybe take a second look. You want to talk with somebody who has experience and results.
Right. Is there anything else you want to say?
I think that's it.
That's pretty much it. I do want to say, we just sat down and had a conversation, and several times we talked about, well, what questions are we going to address? And we talked about a few things, but really we just wanted to sit down and talk and have it come naturally. So if you have any specific questions for Lance in particular, or for me based on this conversation, something we didn't cover, or I know we jumped around a lot, something that more specific that you'd like to know, go ahead and post comments below this video and questions, and we'll address those. Hopefully this was helpful, just to come in and see our marriage and what we walked through. But I think the big takeaway here, and what we really wanted to present, was how we dealt with each other in our marriage, how Lance dealt with me. Obviously, I was producing judgment. I was producing contempt. I was emotionally manipulative at times, and I'm not saying it was all intentional, but he responded with boundaries, not meanly, but firmly where he needed to have boundaries. He continued to live within his freedom, and once he knew the seriousness of the things behind what was being presented, he took action. So, and met with people and had conversations, and eventually, now we're here, and we're in a wonderful, wonderful church home. And just some signs to look for if your spouse is going down these roads. And I think the questions that Lance suggested to ask are great questions. You believe this and you're wanting to do these things. What is the heart behind that? Why are you wanting to do these things? And depending on how they answer, kind of gauging, okay, is this just they're doing these things in their freedom, or there may be some obedient salvation issues beneath the surface. Anything else generally? I think that's it. Okay, well, we are going to go ahead and go, and thank you for taking the time to answer questions. And we're such we're not professional YouTubers. We're just sitting here talking to you. So hopefully you could follow along and it wasn't too jumbled, but post questions below, and maybe we'll see you again in a little bit. Does that work?